Hello everyone, this is part 18 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. The trio would have been an odd one to most who passed by, not that any did Naruto noticed. In fact, many people got one look at Rushi and immediately backtracked, or at least moved to the other side of the street. It didn't last long as they were soon passing the outskirts of the town, but it made Naruto wonder. They weren't like the looks of scorn and hatred he remembered from his time in Konoha, but more along the looks of slight fear or unease, as if they didn't mind the man but still wouldn't prefer to be near him. Naruto didn't see anything immediately wrong with Rushi apart from the obvious fact he was a shinobi, an undoubtedly powerful one given his chakra levels. There was also his rather outlandish appearance. He wasn't exactly wearing the standard Awagakure uniform despite donning their headband. In fact, his clothing looked more like it belonged on somebody who had fought before the first shinobi war. He also noticed the occasional raised eyebrow he got when he tried to get a read on the man through the moisture in the air. His range was much lower when he moved, only around 100 feet, but with Rushi walking right next to him that wasn't much of an issue. There was something about the man's chakra he found strange, almost familiar, yet he still couldn't place it. He noticed Fu giving the man a few discreet looks as well, but most of the time her face was unreadable, so he had no idea if she felt the same or she was just naturally suspicious. He was inclined to believe the latter. Finally, they reached a small campsite set up in a clearing quite a way out of the town. It was fairly simple, a small tent that looked like it could house 2 people at the most and a small but cozy fire enclosed by a ring of rocks. He could hear a stream not too far off, which would explain the pot of stew hanging over the fire, happily boiling away. In all, it looked like the kind of camp you could tear down or set up on a few minutes' notice, faster if you were a ninja. It's not much, but make yourself at home. Naruto looked up at the man as he walked to the other end of the fire, peering into the pot to check on what was probably his dinner. The blonde wasn't sure what to think, but he was anything but rude, so quickly made himself comfortable on a small log that seemed to be there for the express purpose of sitting, Fu quickly joining him in the spot beside him. His cheeks flushed a slightly darker hue at how close her body was pressed up against his, but he said nothing. "So, how can we help you, Rushi-san?" The red-haired man smiled congenially at the pair as he leaned back from the pot of simmering stew. Don't bother with the whole honorific crap, you'll make me feel like that old bastard." With that he smiled pleasantly, seemingly satisfied with the stew as he ladled it out into 3 bowls he procured from seemingly nowhere. Of course Naruto's eyes had seen him unseal them from a pouch beneath his purple kimono, but it was almost so fast he missed it. Impressive indeed. "All right then, Rushi." The redhead just nodded once happily before handing the 2 the bowls of stew, quickly digging into his own like he hadn't eaten in weeks, given his bulky frame, though Naruto found that unlikely. He was already finished before Naruto had finished his first mouthful, smacking his lips appreciatively in a way that told Naruto he wasn't exactly used to company. Nothing like some warm stew at night to keep the chill away. Naruto just nodded his quiet agreement as he continued to sip at the admittedly delicious meaty broth. Somehow Fu managed to keep her expression completely blank even as she ate, although a healthy color had invaded her cheeks as her body unconsciously reacted to the warm meal. "So, what are 2 Jinchuriki doing wandering in this part of Tsuchi no Kuni?" Naruto swore if he hadn't had years of training in a monk's temple he might have immediately spit out a good portion of the stew he had just taken into his mouth. He envied Fu for her ability to never show any emotion if she didn't want to. She merely continued to demurely sip at her own meal, the only indication she heard anything being her hands tightening slightly. The redhead had to chuckle at their reactions even though he had hoped for something more along the lines of shock. Don't worry about it, we're all in good company here." He said it so nonchalantly as he reached for the ladle to the pot again, obviously going for seconds. It made Naruto wonder how much he normally ate or if he was expecting visitors before returning his thoughts to the right track. Suddenly it clicked as his eyes widened slightly, not enough to reveal his Rinnegan but enough that people who knew him well enough would know meant he had a revelation. Which one? Rushi looked up from his second serving with humor glinting in his eyes, a small smirk playing at his lips behind the bowl. I guess as the host it's only fair. He stood up with an extravagant and over-the-top bow that somehow didn't spill a single drop of his meal. I'm Rushi, Jinchuriki of the Yonbi no Saru. He smiled as his hand did a small flourish that wouldn't have looked out of place in a royal court. Naruto was about to answer in kind when the redhead simply raised a hand, looking at them appraisingly. No need, let me guess. His hand moved to his chin as he stroked his beard thoughtfully, eyes flickering over the pair like an auctioneer might treat an antique. Nanabe, correct. He made sure to look directly at Fu as he talked, so as not to miss the slightly surprised look that entered her eyes, her posture not shifting in the slightest. However, when he looked at Naruto, a frown overcame his features, his gaze becoming more penetrating even as his eyes darted off occasionally, as if his mind was elsewhere. The QB, right. His voice seemed more hesitant at that, lacking the confidence of his statement to Fu. So how does Iwa know so much about us? Naruto kept his tone light, but he was already slowly shifting his chakra about in case he had to rapidly leave with Fu. There weren't exactly many ninja who could react before he had a chance to raise his arm. However, his concerns were unfounded as the heavy-set redhead leaned back, letting out a jovial chuckle before quickly returning to his stew as if the tension in the air wasn't palpable. Don't get so worked up, kid. I know because that's what the big guy in my gut's telling me. My connections with a Wagaku are pretty loose. Hell, I'd probably leave if it weren't for Han. His eyes drifted for a moment in thought before he shook himself out of it, returning to his meal to cover up his small hesitation. Naruto just watched him with a critical eye, cautiously eating his food. From the way Rushi was eating, it couldn't be poisoned, not that there were many poisons that could actually work on a Jinchuriki anyway. So what's your interest in us? Rushi looked up, only briefly pausing with the bowl at his lips with a decidedly amused expression. Me. Nothing. I only watched that little brawl you had in the alleyway because I was bored. I might have stepped in if they had gone too far. A smirk alighted on his face as he drained the last of his dinner in a loud slurp. But that wasn't necessary in the end, was it? He made a pointed look at Naruto, who simply shrugged, a congenial look of his own on his tempered features as he drank at the stew more sedately. It was a stupid reason to fight anyway. The man leaned back on his log, placing the bowl to one side as he looked up, a wistful expression marring his features. Not that there are any good reasons to fight. Naruto said nothing at that, but the smallest of frowns appeared over his brow. I mean, sure, you look like the Yondaime Hokage, but it's hardly grounds to lynch you. Naruto simply shrugged off-handedly. He had made that exact same point only half an hour ago. So you don't hate the Yondaime Hokage? Rushi looked down from his sky gazing, catching the blonde's eye as the man looked at him with that same piercing gaze. It made Naruto wonder if it was something all veteran shinobi could do. It certainly felt like those times with Ao. Probably not. Most people in Iwa forget that the old bastard probably killed just as many Konoha shinobi. The Flash just happened to do all of his in one go. At seeing Naruto's raised eyebrow, the redhead clarified. I mean the Sandaime Tsuchikage, Ryoutenban no Unoki. He followed up with a few muttered phrases that Naruto couldn't hear and felt he didn't particularly want to. But nah, I guess I don't hate him. If anything, I respect the man. Naruto looked up at him in surprise. He may have been pretty ignorant of a child, but the fact that Iwa and Konoha hated each other with a passion was not lost on him even then. Don't look so surprised. The man had a flea on sight order for a reason. Even us Jinchuriki weren't exempt. Hell, the only one who could probably have stood against him was the old bastard himself. He sighed wearily, returning his gaze to the sky as his mind obviously drifted back to older, but not necessarily pleasant, memories. I'm just glad that the war ended before that could have happened, two people like that fighting. He whistled appreciatively as he absently threw a piece of wood onto the dwindling fire. They would have remodeled the landscape. Rushi wasn't even exaggerating. With the destruction caused by Jinten and the speed of the Hiraishin, no battlefield would have been the same after a conflict of that proportion. I actually saw him once, Minato Namikaze. The redhead stared wistfully into the fire, none of the previous mirth in his eyes or voice as he watched the flames dance beneath the hanging pot. It was like Naruto and Fu weren't even there anymore and he was lost in his memories. It was strange because Naruto wouldn't have placed him over 40, yet he spoke like an old man. right after he slaughtered an entire battalion of troops in a few seconds. I was part of the reinforcements, but when we got there the entire battlefield was covered in B&B. His eyes gained a haunted look as he remembered that sight that would never leave him. He stood there in the middle of it all, one of those kunai he was so famous for clasped in one hand. He just turned to look at me, his eyes were so full of sadness. It might have been a trick of the light, or my own shock at the time. After all, the man was pretty famous at the time, but this was the event that solidified his reputation, but I could have sworn I saw his hands tremble. Suddenly his head snapped up, as if he had just remembered that he had company. The haunted, wistful look on his face vanished without a trace as it was replaced by a softer smile. But you don't need to listen to my ramblings, little Kuro-chan tells me often enough that they're boring. He looked up, almost amused, as his fingers came up to absently stroke his beard. I guess she probably isn't so little anymore. Just a brief flash of sadness flickered across his features at that before it was gone. I guess I just need an outlet for all the stories I've got pent up in my head, what with me having no family to bore with them. He smiled sadly at the pair, who simply returned it with a sympathetic smile and a more neutral, but understanding look. Actually, that was very interesting. It must be rare to hear the first-hand accounts of a veteran. Naruto smiled amicably as he finished his bowl of stew, gently placing it down beside him. I feel honored. At that Rushi just chortled, leaning down to rest his hands on his knees. Kid, the less you hear about war the better, especially with the I've been through. Naruto's smile took on a sad twinge at that, but he covered it remarkably well. It didn't escape Rushi's notice though, bringing the whole campsite into a stifling silence. Fu could only sit there quietly, her gaze drifting between her blonde companion and the other Jinchuriki. She had no idea what to do in situations like these to break the tension and just sat there, quietly eating her stew as the awkward silence prevailed. Finally though, Rushi straightened up, fixing Naruto with a still warm, but more curious look. So kid, want to tell me why your chakra signature is so confusing? I can feel Son Goku having a small fit inside me as he tried to figure you out. He keeps telling me he can feel more than two of his kind in you too, but that's impossible and I can't sense anybody but us nearby. Naruto's eyebrow rose slightly as he wondered by what means Rushi could sense people. So you talk with your tenant. You have a good relationship then. The red-haired man's eyes narrowed slightly as the blonde redirected the question but answered nevertheless. I can't boast perfect control like the Kumo Jinchuriki can, but yeah, me and Son Goku have a dialogue at least. He's not exactly the easiest guy to get along with and he's prideful as all hell, but in the end, you live with somebody for over 50 years, you learn to either hate them completely or at least tolerate them. Naruto chuckled at that. He could certainly relate in that sense. It seemed the Yonbi, or Son Goku, was quite similar to the Kyuubi in a way. However, Rushi's gaze was now firmly fixed on Naruto as the younger blonde struggled for an answer. Well, I guess you could say I'm special, you see. He was cut off as Rushi raised an hand, waving it dismissively as he rubbed his beard with his other hand. Actually, I've got a better way. Come on, your girlfriend can join in too. With that, he simply raised a fist out in a way Naruto recognized from Kirby, and the blonde looked at it confusedly. Rushi just looked at the two of them expectantly before Naruto hesitantly raised his own hand to complete the fist bump, Fu gently nudging her own hand in from the side. Naruto was about to comment about what they were doing when he suddenly felt a tug in his consciousness, like the times when he meditated to enter his seal. When Naruto opened his eyes again, not remembering closing them, he found himself in a large white expanse with no discernible edges or landmarks. The only notable thing was the fact it seemed to get darker the further away he looked. Suddenly he realized he wasn't alone. It was a strange sensation as he understood that the others had been there all along, but it was like he hadn't been able to notice them before now. He found out soon enough when he heard a deep and decidedly ominous growl reverberate beneath him. I suggest you remove yourself from my head, ninja, before I decided to simply swallow you, as much as it would degrade me to eat one of your wretched kind again. Naruto looked down only to see an expanse of orange fur that was surprisingly coarse for how soft it appeared from afar. Quickly jumping down off the Kyuubi's head, he noticed that it wasn't just the two of them. Shukaku, Matatabi, and Isabu were also there, although the latter was still somehow unconscious. Where are we? Naruto found his voice surprisingly calm given that there were no bars between him and the Kyuubi and the giant fox didn't look to be all that pleasant today. The fox grunted as he looked around, seemingly looking for something as his shrewd red eyes pierced through the blank, monotonous world. It would appear Son Goku's container has drawn us into the Seishin Sekai. It was Matatabi who spoke, sounding as sleepy as a giant beast of cerulean flame could, languidly stretching out while eyeing the Kyuubi carefully. Luckily the fox didn't seem to be in a mood to move or attack his fellow Biju, content for now to simply lie there and glare angrily at nothing. It is kind of shared world we Biju, and by extension our Jinchuriki, can enter to communicate. The Kyuubi snorted at that but didn't look in the direction. Although we haven't used it in centuries, it requires us to be relatively close or, in the case of the Jinchuriki, to be touching. Naruto noticed Shukaku seemed surprisingly quiet. In fact he had been as of late but he didn't question it. Naruto. Naruto turned towards the voice he knew to be Fuu's. It appeared from nowhere accompanied by a loud and rather obnoxious buzzing. Suddenly, as if they had walked through some invisible doorway, Fu and the Nanabi melted into existence near them, giving Naruto his first glimpse of the Nanabi no Kabutamushi. It wasn't quite what Naruto would have expected from a Biju, mainly due to the fact it didn't actually have 7 tails. It was an oddly mismatched creature, reminding him of a cross between a rhinoceros beetle and a glowworm with its blue visor-like face and bright yellow abdomen. The most noticeable thing though were the 6 large, bright yellow wings that fanned out behind it, emerging from the base of its body in a way that you wouldn't immediately think would allow it to fly. The final, tail, actually was a long and thin, spindly appendage that flailed behind it as it hovered, buzzing almost excitedly. It's been a long time brothers, sister. The Nanabi's voice had a distinctly buzzing quality, as if it was trying to speak through a fan. Yet at the same time, in that same strange way as Matatabi, Naruto couldn't help but think its voice sounded somewhat feminine. Also strangely, the giant insect had a strange, uplifting lilt to its voice, far more cheerful than he had seen any of the other Biju, except maybe Shukaku, but the Nanabi definitely lacked his insane qualities, probably for the better. Yes, so many of us have not gathered together since the passing of father. A new deep booming voice that was intimidating, but not on the level the Kyuubi could muster, made itself heard. Everybody besides the fox, who was more content to simply glare at everything as if he would rather be anywhere but here, turned to look at the newcomers. Riding in on an enormous red-furred gorilla with 4 thick tails was Rushi, seemingly perfectly at ease as he casually stood atop a Biju's head. Greetings again Naruto, Fu. The older Iwanin inclined his head politely at the two as they did the same, Naruto taking the opportunity to notice that Fu was also riding atop the head of her respective Biju, although she did not look nearly as comfortable doing so. So would anybody care to tell me why I was dragged into this horrendous meeting of some of my least favorite beings on this earth? The Kyuubi seemed to make an effort to keep his voice decidedly bored and apathetic, but it still carried an edge of irritation. All of the Biju simply stared at the fox and he gladly glared back at each and every one of them, even Isabu, even though he was still unconscious. Please, you hate everybody. Again Naruto noted the strange distorted effect the Nanabi's voice had. In a way it was oddly calming. It helped its tone was very upbeat. I fail to see your point insect. The Nanabi huffed irritably at that, although it came out more of an agitated buzz, like when you disturb a hornet's nest. Still arrogant as ever Kyuubi. Son Goku's voice had an incredible booming quality, catching everybody's attention instantly, except the Kyuubi's of course, but that was to be expected. Naruto also took notice that none of the Biju would refer to the Kyuubi by his real name, whatever it was. Although from the intense glares the great fox kept sending everybody and the way his tail swayed ominously behind him, he couldn't blame them. And you all are just as pitiful as I remember. With that the fox lay his head down on his paws, apparently done with the conversation and his fellow Biju in general. He must not have had a choice in being within the shared plane, or Naruto had the feeling he would have left already. You are insufferable fox. Just because you have more tails does not make you superior to us. At that the Kyuubi cracked open one very large and very irritated red eye, making sure to point it directly at Son Goku. He had successfully gotten Matatabi and to a lesser extent Shukaku to stop talking to him in any manner out of fear. He could do the same to the giant monkey. Do you wish to challenge me Yonbi? Strangely his voice held no immediate anger, but it still had a deep, growling, menacing quality that made everybody else tremor slightly, besides Naruto, who was used to it, and the Nanabe due to it being the closest in terms of power to the Kyuubi. Bravely, or foolishly, the Yonbi held its ground, obviously not very appreciative of the name the Kyuubi had chosen to call him. Are you so full of pride that you believe you could defeat all four of us? Naruto felt the large simian was purposefully leaving out the Sanbi due to its incapacitated state. The Kyuubi merely snorted, closing his eye dismissively as he continued to ignore everybody. You are right, it would not even be worth my time. You would be crushed like the paltry beings you are beneath my tails. A low growl emerged from Son Goku's tea, but he made no move to do anything. He may have been an arrogant and prideful being, but that in no way meant the Kyuubi could not back up his words. There was a reason the Great Fox was seen as a being comparable to a walking natural disaster. Its power eclipsed even the next strongest of the Biju. Even now he was the largest thing in this strange white world by a great margin. Even the Nanabe just couldn't compare. Maybe it would be best to simply leave the Kyuubi to his rest. For the first time since coming into this world, Matatabe spoke up, her voice oddly timid for a being of such immense power. She realized that she had provoked the Kyuubi plenty during their meetings lately, and now there were no bars between the two of them. It wasn't like the other Biju would readily come to her aid, except the Nanabe, who was a sort of peacemaker in the group, and possibly Shukaku if Naruto told him to. However, even their combined power paled in comparison to the fox. Ah, so you never did manage to grow a spine then, Matatabe? The flaming cat hissed slightly at Son Goku, but ultimately looked submissive. Unlike others, she knew what her place was. With Shukaku too insane to notice or care, she might as well have been the weakest of the Biju. Sometimes even Shukaku made up for his lesser chakra with his sheer difficulty to be hurt and the way he would madly rush into combat like a berserker. Anyway, I assume there is more to this gathering than simply catching up. The Nanabe's voice suddenly cut in, always the peacemaker, despite her hating the position due to the arguments between such powerful beings it put her in. The worst had been an argument between the Hachibi and the Kyuubi that she thought she was actually going to be destroyed in. Luckily, not long after that, the Biju had gone their separate ways in the world and they had never come to an actual fight. Speaking of which, where are the containers of Shukaku, Matatabe, and Isabu? I do not detect them anywhere nearby. Son Goku's voice had calmed slightly, but he was still sending venomous looks towards the currently placid fox. That would be me. Suddenly Naruto found everybody's gaze squarely on him. It was a little unnerving given that besides Rushi and Fu, the others were all beings of incomprehensible power. He weathered the critical stares of the Nanabe and Yonbi though until both gasped as he opened his eyes. How is this possible? How does this ninja have father's eyes? Surprisingly, this came from the Nanabe, who had immediately hovered closer to Naruto, trying to peer closer into his eyes despite their rather large-scale difference. To help, he hovered a little ways off the ground, only adding to the large insect's wonder. He even possesses father's powers. For a moment the Nanabe's voice sounded almost childlike in her awe, her versawed face continuing to stare at Naruto rather invasively. The growl emanating from the Kyuubi's tea went mostly ignored, although Isabu stirred slightly. Hi, I'm Naruto Uzumaki. The great insect Biju nodded slowly, still entranced by the swirling ripple pattern that had been such an important focus in her young life. I am Chume. Finally the Nanabe seemed to snap out of her self-induced trance as she leaned back, forcing Fu to grab the horn on her head to stop herself being thrown off. But you can call me Lucky Number 7 if you want. Naruto blinked at that, wondering just who had called Chume that, ever. A pleasure to meet you, Chume, Son Goku. The large insect bristled at that, a shudder running down her wings. She hadn't been called by her name in far too long. A loud huff echoed from behind him as eyes turned to Son Goku, staring at the much smaller blonde appraisingly. So you go around wielding the eyes of our father, the most powerful ninja to ever live. What makes you worthy of such an honor? Naruto smiled in what he hoped was a placating manner. He could see this was a rather touchy subject for the large primate. Nothing. I do not deserve to have such power, nor have I earned the right to wield these eyes. Many of the Biju blinked in surprise at the brutally honest and at the same time incredibly humble answer. Even the Kyuubi cracked open a single eye in interest for a brief moment. But hopefully I can use their power for something that will make me worthy. He smiled brightly as he floated higher into the air until he was eye level with most of the chakra creatures. Because my goal is to bring peace to the world, and that includes the Biju. I wish to take the hate that has been placed on you over the years and help you find freedom. Silence resonated through the blank space as everybody stared at him. His voice sounded powerful, echoing through the empty plane as everybody's eye were firmly fixed on him. And this is why you have made yourself the Jinchuriki of 4 of us. A feat that would have seen any other ninja burned from the inside out. How do we know you aren't simply like the rest of your deceitful kind, using us for our power to fill that insatiable hole all humans have in their heart for power? Naruto smiled softly at the Yonbi. It seemed the Kyuubi wasn't the only Biju with a deep-seated resentment towards humanity. You can't know, and nothing I say now could prove you wrong anyway. But I promise you that I will do everything in my power to lift the hatred from this world. And I never go back on my promises. Again his voice rang out strongly, captivating even the other Jinchuriki in the shared mental space. Finally it was Nanabe who broke the silence that had overcome the area again. You are an interesting ninja. From what brief glimpses of the world I get through Fu-chan I see you are kind and strong. Then the Nanabe, the third strongest being in perhaps the entire world, did something nobody expected. The enormous winged beetle bowed its head forward subserviently. If it had a mouth then a small smile would be playing across it. Instead it released a happy but anxious hum. I am willing to place my faith in humanity one last time, in remembrance of our father whose dreams so closely matched your own. Naruto just blinked in shock, suddenly feeling incredibly self-conscious of the enormous weight that had placed itself upon his shoulders with her words. As do I. Matatabe adopted a similar pose, bowing her flaming head towards Naruto, only increasing that feeling of weight pressing down on him. Yeah, Shukaku will help father because Shukaku wants father's dream to come true. Naruto felt himself breathing faster as the large sand construct also bowed his head, although it appeared to unbalance the Ichibi slightly making the gesture seem rather clumsy. His eyes flickered to the Yonbi, not quite knowing what to expect from the giant ape as it stared at him with the same appraising look Rushi had before. I will never bow to a mere child. Naruto felt himself deflate slightly at the words but it appeared Sengoku was not finished. However I have never seen one move my siblings in such a way since our father's passing. You are certainly an interesting ninja and for now I will place what little faith I have in your measly race upon your shoulders. With that it huffed in a manner reminiscent of the Kyuubi whenever he had to salvage his pride after saying something not completely hostile or malicious. It was nice to meet you Naruto-kun, take care of Fu-chan for me. Naruto watched as the Nanabe faded away, waving one of her spindly arms at him rather happily. The Yonbi soon faded as well, just leaving Naruto with the 4 Biju he knew so intimately until they too vanished. Naruto sighed wistfully as he looked around. He suddenly felt very heavy as he dropped to the floor. His eyes were wide with wonder, not quite believing all of that had just happened. Eventually though his vision started to fade away as his consciousness slipped from the shared realm. It was already late by the time the 3 Jinchuriki woke up from the Seishin Sekai, so Rushi graciously allowed the 2 to stay in his camp for the night. Naruto had sensed no malicious feelings or underhanded schemes from the man, so he accepted. Luckily his impressions seemed to be correct, and when they woke up the next morning nothing seemed out of place. In fact they had woken up at first sunlight while Rushi seemed more than content to snore away the morning, looking to have no plans on waking up any time soon. Naruto and Fu amused themselves by discussing what had happened the previous night. Fu especially seemed troubled by it all. Meeting the Nanabe was an eye-opening experience for the mint-haired girl. She still vividly remembered the malice and hatred she could feel, and had to control, when she used the Bijuu's chakra shroud. To see the rather happy and exuberant Chume shook that ingrained image she had of violent and merciless Biju. She actually felt a shred of guilt at so callously using the Nanabe's chakra without her permission, feeling like a thief. Naruto had reassured her that he would teach her a method of meditation so the 2 could communicate better. After all, one of his mantras was that understanding is the basis for any healthy relationship and the first step at erasing, or at least healing hatred. So the rest of the morning, up until Rushi awoke, Naruto had been teaching Fu how to lose herself to her inner subconscious via meditation. They had been making good progress before a certain sleepy redhead interrupted them, mumbling about breakfasts and unruly Biju. Finally, when the trio had finished their breakfast of leftover stew, something Rushi seemed perfectly content with but left Naruto and Fu a little green, everybody seemed awake enough to hold a conversation. Naruto and Rushi were sitting across from one another, staring over the dying embers of the small campfire while Fu was off to one side, her eyes closed in concentration and her legs crossed in a decent attempt at a meditative pose. So kid, now that the morning's begun properly, I guess we have things to talk about. Naruto had to suppress a sweat drop from making itself apparent on his forehead. It was nearly 11 o'clock and Rushi only now considered the morning having begun. He had a feeling the man and his senpai would not get along all that well. What would you like to start with? Naruto was all for talking. Rushi had proven himself somewhat reliable in the short time they had known him, and he had a good relationship with his tenant, which was a plus in Naruto's eyes. As long as what they talked about didn't endanger anybody Naruto cared about, like his fellow monks at the temple or Fu, of course. Hey, how about those fancy eyes of yours? I've heard of the Rinnegan before, but only as a legend. Naruto nodded. That was understandable enough considering the last bearer lived around a millennia ago. Plus, with the Uchiha being wiped out to near extinction and the Hyuga rarely leaving Konoha for long, it wasn't often people got to see one of the legendary three Dujutsu anymore. Yes, Naruto had heard about the Uchiha. It was big news in the temple at the time, just as it had been across the entire elemental nations. At the time he had felt a grim satisfaction at the news, the memory of those Sharingan eyes too deeply set in one of his worst memories. However, over time he had found himself appalled at the thought he was happy with the extinction of an entire clan. The ones who had Mtsuki and Ayami had met their swift justice at his own hands, or eyes as it were, and he shouldn't shift his stigma to the rest of their clan. Of course that didn't stop the Kyuubi from rejoicing in his own menacing way when he had heard the news. It was the first and only time he had seen the great fox smile in a non-menacing way. I guess that's a good enough place to start. I'm not going to tell you anything of my abilities, but I'll tell you that I awakened them when I was young and I am unable to deactivate them. Rushi just nodded thoughtfully. The boy's reservations about revealing his power were understandable, even if it didn't sate his curiosity. Hey, so where exactly are you from, kid? Last I heard the Kyuubi was safely locked away in Konoha. I can only assume that you were his Jinchuriki first. Naruto nodded quickly, wondering how the man could know that but letting it slide for now. Rushi had already revealed indirectly that he was incredibly shrewd when he needed to be, sometimes making eerily accurate observations based on very little evidence. Yes, I was originally from Konohagakure no Sato, but shortly after awakening the Rinnegan I lived at the Fire Temple where they helped me understand my power. At the time I was unaware of what I held, but certain circumstances opened my eyes to it. He wasn't going to tell anybody about Sora. The boy didn't need that kind of attention. After all, Pseudo Jinchuriki were as sought after as the real thing. Kinkaku and Ginkaku were excellent example of just the kind of shinobi they could grow to become. Alright then, what about the others? You've certainly been busy. If I'm right, the Ichibi is from Suna, the Nibi is Kumo's, and the Mizukage of Kirigakure was the Jinchuriki of the Sanbi last I checked. Rushi wouldn't admit it, but the power that would suggest in the boy frightened him to no end. Jinchuriki was some of the closest guarded secrets any hidden village had, especially Kumo, who went to extreme lengths to keep them safe. The fact that this boy might have been the one to take down a cage, as he saw no other reason why he would be the one to hold the Sanbi, was equally unsettling. I travel a lot and things tend to happen around me. Naruto sighed at that. He wished he was exaggerating, but if he didn't know any better, it was like Inari, the deity himself, was following him around, purposefully tipping the scales against him. If it helps though, the method I used to extract the Biju doesn't harm the Jinchuriki. In fact, it actually gave them a rather large boost in their chakra reserves due to the influx of chakra leaving their body, stretching their pathways and coils. It would worsen their control quite a bit, but nothing more training couldn't fix given time, and as he had seen with Gaara, their Biju given abilities remained with them. So you could extract Son Goku from me without me dying. Rushi's voice was more curious than actually suggestive, but Naruto couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the older man. From what he had gathered, the two shared a good relationship, even if they didn't always see eye to eye due to the Yonbi's pride. Would you want me to? Rushi sighed heavily, probably the most negative thing the blonde had seen from the older Jinchuriki. Hey, I'm gonna level with you, kid, I'm pretty old. I may not look it, but I'm 56 and I've seen far too much in my lifetime. I'm probably the oldest living Jinchuriki, and trust me when I say it weighs heavy on your shoulders after this long. I haven't seen the village I was raised in for over a decade, and I've been wandering around Tsuchi no Kuni like a hermit for even longer. Another weary sigh escaped his lips as he leaned down so his elbows rested on his knees. I'm tired, and old, and soon enough they're going to recall me to the village so they can switch Son Goku into a fresh young Jinchuriki and start all over again. He snorted derisively at that, and Naruto couldn't help but share the sentiment quietly. I don't want to condemn some poor kid to a life like that. Hated and ostracized for something that he has no control over. He looked up with a small smile that, for the first time since Naruto had met him, reached his eyes. With you here, and what you can do, then I don't have to. You said your goal is to free the Biju, right? Then I can bring you one step closer to that, and at the same time my burden is relieved. He chuckled to himself as his eyes gained that far-off melancholic look. Maybe I could go visit little Kuro-chan again. He quickly shook himself back to reality with a warm smile aimed at Naruto. What do you say? Naruto just blinked in surprise before a smile of his own made its way onto his face. It was the next day and the atmosphere was light as Naruto and Fu said their farewells to Rushi. The older redhead was already in the process of packing up his camp as the duo began to leave. The tent was disassembled and the fire was doused. Before they went much further though, Naruto felt a hand on his elbow, pulling him back. Rushi had him by the arm but wasn't looking at him, instead fiddling with a pouch underneath his kimono before victoriously pulling out a small scroll and handing it over to the blonde. I almost forgot, your friend mentioned you were looking for earth manipulation techniques. I wrote down what I knew here plus a few notes to make it a bit easier on you. He smirked as he patted the smaller blonde on the back before grinning, it's the least I could do for you. Naruto just nodded thankfully, a smile of his own on his face as he walked away, waving all the while to the strange but kind redhead. He caught up with Fu, who had been waiting for him further along the forest path, and after briefly explaining what Rushi had wanted she simply nodded and they continued. As they walked, Naruto found his mind wandering onto the scroll in his hand, earth manipulation as the last of the elements he had to master. He wondered if anybody else had ever attempted to master all 5 of the elemental transformations, except for the original sage. However, soon his mind drifted from even that as he began to think about chakra itself, the concept that had eluded him ever since he had begun this journey. Naruto. He sighed wistfully as he thought about all the things he had learnt on his journeys. So many questions had been answered over time, but even more had been raised as a result. Naruto. He struggled to think why chakra could take on the properties of an element and how an energy could even change like that. The slight headache that throbbed dully in the back of his head wasn't exactly helping his concentration. Naruto. It got him thinking about the problem that Matatabi had brought up, the aspect he was missing in the Banbutsu Suzu she wouldn't reveal. She had said he had to understand the nature of chakra to complete it, but that was exactly the problem he was struggling with. Perhaps once he mastered the earth transformation he would gain some insight. He frowned as his head throbbed again, his vision beginning to blur heavily. Naruto. Fu caught the blonde quickly as he suddenly dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. She had noticed he was looking pale and he had begun to sweat despite the fact it was rather cool out, but he seemingly hadn't heard her when she called him. Now he was lying in her arms, clearly unconscious with a pained expression on his face. The girl barely showed it, but she was incredibly worried for her friend. She had never been sick, she had never seen Naruto get sick despite all the rain they had traveled through, and as far as she knew Jinchuriki couldn't get sick, so she was rather helpless here. She realized the two were rather exposed out in the middle of the path. Bandits would be no problem to hear, but shinobi were a different story. Fu was confident in her abilities. It helped she was a Jinchuriki and had recently come out of a war, which definitely helped to hone her abilities. However, a normal squad of Chunin with a Junin commander would probably be enough to make her access the Nanabi's chakra, and that would be enough to draw the attention of other Junin in the area. This deep in Tsuchi no Kuni, where they were closer to Iwagakure than the border, that would be a mistake. Instead, she grabbed Naruto under the arms, hoisting him somewhat to his feet, and began to drag him off to the side, into the rather sparse forest that bordered the path. She tried to make it as comfortable as possible for the blonde, but the way his body would occasionally convulse in pain made that rather difficult. She was glad he had taken to keeping his shakuju stuck to his back while they were walking outside of towns, otherwise she would have had to leave it behind. She didn't think Naruto would be particularly happy about that when he woke up. Finally reaching a decent place within the forest that gave her good lines of sight in all directions, she lay Naruto down on the softest piece of grass she could find. He looked very pale now, his normally tan skin taking on a pallid, unhealthy hue that was only worsened by the slight sheen of cold sweat covering his face. Occasionally his arm or leg would twitch as varying looks of pain crossed his sleeping features. When Fu placed a hand against his forehead, he was hot to the touch, probably much worse than a normal fever, not that she had much experience. Deciding that the first thing she needed to do was to cool him down, she quickly scouted out a nearby stream. She soaked a cloth and quickly ran back over to the blonde, placing it on his forehead. The difference was instant. Naruto's face calmed slightly, no longer appearing to be in agony and instead in mild discomfort, while his sporadic convulsions lessened. The mint-haired girl sighed in relief, wiping away some of the sweat that had accumulated on her own brow from her worry. What's wrong with you, Naruto? All she could do now was wait and hopefully deal with any symptoms as they arose. It wasn't her ideal solution, but there wasn't much more she could do. In comparison to the relatively peaceful atmosphere of the outside world, the space within Naruto's seal was in utter chaos. Pipes all over the labyrinthine corridors had burst or were leaking profusely, flooding the entire area with acrid, foul chakra. It burned away at the ground, walls and anything else it came into contact with, causing even more damage to form on the pipes, perpetuating the cycle. Even deeper within the maze-like structure, the room that had now become octagonal with 5 cage doors occupying the walls was slowly filling with the water-like chakra. Right in the middle, almost peacefully floating atop the miasma of thick, virulent chakra, was Naruto. He was clearly unconscious, much to the worry of some of his tenants watching on from within their respective cages. The vile chakra was even leaking into their cages, a testament to just how weakened the seal had become if the boundary between tenant and jailer had become so flimsy. Father! Shukaku was worriedly pounding on the bars of his cell, desperately trying to awaken the slowly drowning blonde. He seemed uncaring that the water pooling around his lower body was slowly eroding away at his sandy body. Naruto. Likewise, Matatabi was doing her best to catch the blonde's attention before he became lost to them completely. At this rate it would actually be rather easy for the Biju to force their way out of their seal. They would of course have to wait to regenerate, but Matatabi didn't want that to be at the cost of Naruto's life. The blonde had shown he genuinely cared about the Biju, and she hadn't seen that since their father's passing. What is wrong with the ninja? Son Goku was watching curiously from his new cage. Somewhat of an improvement compared to the far more shoddy seal that had contained him within Rushi. He turned to the Kyuubi's cage where the fox was also watching impassively, his red eyes narrowed at Naruto. Unlike the others who were now standing in the water leaking into their cage, there was a small field around the Kyuubi that was completely dry. He refused to be touched by a human's chakra. It was insulting. The worthless ninja has overstepped the limit of his weak body. He had not yet fully assimilated the turtle's chakra before absorbing your own. It put far too much strain on him and sent his feeble mind into shock. This is the price he pays for his hubris in thinking the sage's eyes would see him through any situation. His words were cold and were practically a growl. In honesty, he would prefer it if Naruto lived. Reforming was a painful process, and as the strongest Biju it would take him the longest out of the 5 of them. With the human alive, there was still the chance of him being released or finding his own way out. Father! The fox's words only added to Shukaku's hysteria as the tanuki frantically pounded the cell's bars. However, even as weak as the seal had become, he was nowhere near strong enough to cause any kind of damage. In fact, out of all of them, only Son Goku and the Kyuubi might have been able to break free, although the former didn't look to be doing anything and the Kyuubi looked less than interested in even moving. What can we do? Matatabi herself had only grown more desperate. She could no longer hit the bars of her cells as the water had encroached on her cage too much, and she was afraid of being weakened by her flames being doused. She still managed to see the penetrating gaze the Kyuubi sent her way, its open red eye firmly locked on her, silencing any other cries she might have had. Be silent, you miserable cat. With that, the fox lazily moved one of its tails, hesitating for a moment as it swayed before the bars of his cells before pushing it between the gaps. Normally this would have been impossible for him, but the seal had truly become a shade of itself without Naruto managing the enormous quantities of chakra within himself. Briefly the fox's lips twitched and its eyes narrowed, but he didn't make a sound. Matatabi watched in awe as the long orange tail reached across the flooded room, the furs smoking slightly as if it were being constantly electrocuted. There was a reason the cell's manifestation only needed to be bars. With a biju to try and reach outside of the cage they would feel immense pain. She could only imagine how agonizing it must be for the Kyuubi, especially using his tail, which was the most sensitive part of a biju. Finally the smoking tail of chakra reached where Naruto was floating in the water, his body dipping dangerously low and only his head not submerged. For a moment the Nibi thought the fox was going to skewer the boy on the tip of his tail. It certainly looked that way from how the Kyuubi was angling it, point down. However, to her surprise the fox merely poked the boy on the forehead, gently even, in a way she would have never thought possible for the malicious being of destruction. There was a momentary flash of light before the water level in the room began to drop, slowly filtering away as the Kyuubi quickly retracted his tail, never once showing his pain. Foolish ninja. The Kyuubi huffed before closing his eyes in disdain, offended that he was forced to debase himself and save the pathetic human. The other biju was simply in shock. If they hadn't known any better they would have sworn the Kyuubi just did something out of kindness, even though his demeanor said otherwise. Shukaku didn't seem to care either way, but he at least seemed happy Naruto was no longer in any immediate danger. Sure enough, when Matatabi looked back, shaking herself out of her shock, Naruto had disappeared from the seal. Fu had sat in that clearing watching over Naruto until the sun had set, sending the forest around her into a serene twilight that clashed horribly with the tumultuous feelings of worry in her sea. She had set up a fire to keep her and Naruto warm, but there had been no change in his condition. If anything, he seemed to get worse. She couldn't explain it, but Naruto seemed to be sending out random pulses of chakra at irregular intervals. It worried her because sometimes she could feel the distinct pressure of biju chakra with the pulses. Even stranger though, once the chakra pulsed out of his body, often accompanied by a small groan from the blonde, he seemed to subconsciously draw it back into his body with his preta path. For that at least she was grateful, as she couldn't be sure who might have noticed the copious amounts of chakra he was just throwing off in his unconscious stupor. If she hadn't been there for herself she might have, though a fight was taking place between two very powerful shinobi. Unfortunately for her she hadn't been the only one to notice this. These random bursts of unrestrained chakra had managed to catch the attention of a nearby shinobi patrol. In her worry over Naruto, and her senses being disrupted by the chakra saturating the air around them, she hadn't managed to notice them until they were practically in the clearing already. Quickly she found herself caught off guard by a pair shinobi. She would have guessed Chunin, but it was hard to tell with her senses so distorted as they were. It's just two kids, Kuretsuki. Are you sure this is what you felt? Luckily the squad seemed confused themselves, looking at her and the unconscious blonde beside her strangely. The one who spoke was a rather hulking boy with a decidedly dumb expression on his confused face. He had a large, bulbous nose squished between his bloated cheeks that were red from the running he had obviously been doing. He wore a two-sleeved version of the usual Iwa uniform with a large yellow scarf and his forehead protector attached to a dull red bandana. Shut it, Akatsuki. Yes, I'm sure I felt it coming from here. Stop questioning me and just do something not completely moronic for once. Fu raised an eyebrow at the two's behavior. From the names and mannerisms between one another she would have pegged them as siblings, however the two looked nothing alike. The one who seemed to be in charge was an older girl, maybe 14 or 15, with short black hair and pupil-less pink eyes, wearing fishnet leggings and the standard one-sleeved Iwa outfit. Alright, Kuretsuki. With that the much larger boy, whose age was indeterminable due to his improbable size, wandered off from the clearing. Kuretsuki's eyebrow twitched violently, but she did nothing to dissuade the boy from wherever he was going. She was obviously quite glad for the reprieve. When he was gone she turned her full attention to the younger girl who had moved closer to Naruto's side protectively. Alright, what's going on here? I felt chakra being released in pulses from this location. Who are you trying to signal? Fu just blinked, surprised the girl had been able to detect Naruto's chakra for the short time it was outside of his body, before shaking her head and realizing the implications of the question. We weren't signaling anybody. My friend is ill and fell unconscious. I've just been waiting for him to wake up. Kuretsuki raised a skeptical eyebrow at that, but after taking a quick glance at Naruto, it wasn't hard to see the boy was obviously unwell. His skin was pale and his breaths were coming out ragged and irregular. Occasionally she would feel a pulse of chakra from his body, only for it to disappear moments later as if returning to his body. However, that seemed impossible to her unless he had some kind of Kekkei Genkai. That was the only thing that would do something like that without the boy being conscious. What's wrong with him? Kuretsuki got a strange feeling from the boy. She could practically feel the power just brimming beneath the surface, and it unsettled her coming from such a young boy. The resemblance to the Yellow Flash, at least from what she had seen on pictures, was also noteworthy. But then again, she presumed most spiky blonde-haired boys with blue eyes would bear the same resemblance. He had the wrong facial structure anyway, too rounded. I don't know, he seemed pale as we walked and then he just collapsed. Kuretsuki sighed. Technically she was on patrol right now and secretly she was hoping to run into Rushi. They had been getting reports he was in this area lately. She didn't really feel like she had a lot of time to waste here, especially if it really was just two kids and not spies messaging their contacts like she had thought. Alright, let me take a look. She walked towards the unconscious boy, but Fu quickly moved in her way, protectively leading Kuretsuki to raise an eyebrow. Look, I know a little medical ninjutsu, nothing too advanced but enough to at least see what's wrong with him. Fu frowned but moved out of the way nonetheless and allowed Kuretsuki to crouch down next to him, her hand beginning to glow green. Slowly she moved it back and forth across Naruto's sea before letting it hover above his forehead, her face the picture of concentration. Huh, that's pretty strange. Fu's face reflected nothing of her emotions, but inside that simple phrase nearly sent her into a panic. I've never seen anything like this. If I had anything to compare it to, it would be the strain from chakra exhaustion. Except his reserves are full, more than full even. It's like he has more chakra than his body can contain. Kuretsuki went quiet as her face scrunched up in focus, the green glow around her hand intensifying. Just who are you two anyway? Blonde hair wasn't a common trait in Tsuchi no Kuni, which was probably a good thing, so she was curious about where this strange boy was from. Naruto is a monk on his pilgrimage and he rescued me, so I am traveling with him. Technically what Fu said wasn't a lie. She was missing out a great deal of the details though. Kuretsuki allowed the glow around her hand to stop as she looked up, appearing somewhat tired from the technique. A monk, this kid. He barely looks 12. Fu simply shrugged, leaving Kuretsuki with her question unanswered. Well anyway, sorry, I really have no idea what's wrong with him. I can't even tell if he'll wake up or not. She frowned as a thoughtful look appeared on her face, her eyes flickering between Naruto and Fu. There's a rumor I've heard that Tsunade of the Sannin is somewhere in the area. Maybe you'll get lucky and run into her. Fu widened her eyes at that. The legendary medic of the Densetsu no Sannin was in Tsuchi no Kuni. Seeing her confused look, Kuretsuki elaborated. It's the reasons patrols are so high in this area. While the woman's been off of Konoha's active shinobi registry for years, Gigi still feels uncomfortable leaving a Sannin roaming loose in the country. The girl sighed in irritation slightly. As much as I hate to say it about a tree hugger like her, her skills as a medic are still the best in the world, even Gigi says so. If your friend doesn't wake up soon, maybe you should seek her out. Fu nodded slowly. She had no idea how she might go about finding a Sannin, but it was certainly worth a thought. Well, I guess we should probably be going then. Kuretsuki stood up, looking around to try and see where her idiot partner went. Sorry about your friend there, I hope he gets better. Fu nodded her thanks. However, just as Kuretsuki was about to leave, Naruto began to spasm on the ground, his body almost vibrating as he began leaking chakra in droves. Fu's eyes widened as she realized what was about to happen, but by the time she opened her mouth to warn the other girl, the ground around him exploded. Fu was sent flying back, using what grace she had as a shinobi to flip midair and land firmly on the trunk of a tree, sticking there with chakra. Kuretsuki was less lucky as she hadn't been prepared for the sudden blast of unrestrained gravitational forces. Like Fu, she too was sent flying back, however she managed to hit a tree headfirst, severely dazzling the Chunin as she slumped the ground, vision swimming. Fu dropped to the ground, marveling at the 10-foot crater now surrounding an obviously awake and very confused Naruto who was rubbing his head. He looked around at the crater he was in before his eyes connected with Fu's, blinking rapidly. Fu, what happened? Where are we? That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.